religious practice. It's a funny thing that as I began to study celibacy, and where does this come from? Why does it persist? That's so difficult. It oftentimes isn't practiced. It becomes a kind of a sham at times. But I found out that even in the animal kingdoms, there are certain animals that practice celibacy.
Yes, I raise cattle. I've got a couple of bulls in that category. They've been a huge waste of money. But Arthur, I want to bring you in at this point.
Yeah.
There are many different versions of the origins of celibacy in the Catholic Church. Which is the definitive version, do you believe?
I'm not sure it's definitive, but let's look at what happened as best as common knowledge and current scholarship tells it. For the first 1,000 years in the Catholic Church, Catholic tradition, celibacy wasn't a requirement. The two, and Richard and Chris will join in, I'm sure, on this, but there were two trends going on. And one of those trends was money, and the other trend was sex per se, and women. By the 11th century, the totally screwed up attitude that the Catholic Church had towards women intruded on the discussion of celibacy. On the woman's side, the wife's side, the concubine's side, the argument was, if you've touched the body of a woman, then you can't touch the sacred host in the Eucharist. And so women were always dirty. It's this whole thing about, you still get it with mothering, with women going to church after they've delivered to be cleansed.
And this, of course, is not just applicable to Catholicism. The same attitudes apply if you're visiting a Hindu temple in Bali, for example.
Absolutely. It comes out of the whole tribal notion of the subjugation of women, and that women were the temptresses and women were the dirty ones. Sorry?
In the 10th century, the partners, not the priests, but the partners, the women living in concubinage, were the ones who were scourged in punishment. Now, that happened in Augsburg in the 10th century.
Oh, certainly. They were scourged, and often the women or the kids were sold into slavery.
That's right.
Turned a profit on it. And the other part, of course, was the money, that the married bishops and priests tended to look on endowments to the church as the way of starting a little nobility, a line of nobility of their own. They would hand over these endowments to their firstborn, and the next thing you know, you've got a nice little castle somewhere, a nice little plot of land, and you're building up the family. Well, the church didn't like this alienation of the endowments, and you had two things going together. The worst of the two, obviously, was the whole attitude towards women. Even though we can flip back in this conversation to the 11th century, I think there's a more recent place to flip back to. I'm 66, and sexual repression existed right across society when I was a kid. I mean, you didn't talk about sex. There was no education in sex when I was 12 and 14. I went to a boys' school. The BBC was running a sex education program 4 weeks in a row. So my school principal, the headmaster, bought the books. So every boy in the school got a book on sex, how babies are made, but all done very scientifically. And we were allowed to listen to programs 1, 2, and 4.
Gosh, 3 sounds tantalising.
So we read about it. We still didn't know how it was done.
I don't understand you Catholics. I went to a series of state schools. We discovered these things for ourselves. You should have gone to Eltham High and caught the late train as I did.
Well, if you were in a co-ed school, that was fine. But if you were in a boys' school, well, it wasn't easy to practice. You couldn't get to
bit more difficult.
You practiced on boys. There's that great line in the Russia House where Sean Connery is being investigated by the CIA man, and the CIA man, as he's doing the polygraph test, says, Mr. Barley, have you ever had a homosexual experience? And Sean Connery says, well, just the usual handheld job at school, same as yourself.
This is Classic LNL on ABC Radio National, and joining me in this 2002 discussion on celibacy, were Arthur Jones, reporter-at-large and former editor with the National Catholic Reporter in the United States, Chris Geraghty, former priest and theology lecturer, and Richard Sipe, another former priest, now, surprise, surprise, a psychotherapist. Richard, does celibacy mean the same thing in the Catholic Church all over the world? Is there a Greenwich Mean standard of celibacy, or is it sort of, are the goalposts shifted in Central Africa or the US or even in Australia?
Well, I've had many missionary friends in Africa, and I do know that marriage of priests and bishops is openly condoned there. I've been told by men who teach in seminaries there that they just don't talk about celibacy, and that sex has a very different meaning culturally. In South America, I've interviewed a number of the Jesuit missionaries who come back from South America, and I remember I was shocked and not understanding years ago when a man came back from South America, Central America, South America. He said, someday the church is going to make those men get married. And I didn't know what he meant. Of course what he meant was that the priest lived in the parish as and presented himself as the priest, and then he had his woman and his wife in the barrio, who oftentimes was looked down upon as a second-class citizen by everybody, and people knew that she was the priest's woman, but she didn't have any of the benefits or the equality with her priest companion. So in some ways, and in the United States too, I've come to the conclusion that in many ways there is an optional celibacy. There are a number of priests who have long-term companions, some long-term companions with women, some long-term male companions, and this is the way they live.
Well, I'm glad you've raised this issue, because before we came on air, I was talking to Chris about a very famous Australian, prominent in our political life, who is still a priest and who lives openly with a woman. They're not married, but they've got an open relationship, had it for years, and there's been no suggestion that he be excommunicated or punished for this. Do you know of other cases like this, Chris?
No. He's rather public. Most priests who want to leave and get married want a dispensation. They want the okay from the church that when they get up to heaven, God will forget that they were ever ordained. Most are in that position. Some of them.
Did you get your ticket of leave?
No,
you didn't.
No. But it's very hard now to get tickets of leave, so people are just leaving and going about their business. I have to say that.
Come on, Chris! You're now a judge in the Compensation Court of New South Wales. If you can't pull strings,
I don't really want to pull any strings.
Right.
I'm quite happy the way I am, but. I have to say that there is still quite a lot of priests who are living the celibate life, and witnessing to their belief in the hereafter, witnessing to their service of people, to their commitment to the role that they play, the religious leaders.
No one could possibly object to it. Not that people outside the church have got much place to object, I guess, if it was optional. It's the fact that it's so damn compulsory. Arthur, the great debate around Vatican II, as it's known, in the early 60s, opened up the windows in every church on earth. For everything was up for grabs, up for discussion, except, it would seem, sexuality. Why was that the case?
I think it goes back to the 60s. I think that sex still wasn't being discussed. It probably wasn't until the late 60s and the early 70s that you began to see newspaper articles with words in them that I didn't hear, for example, until I went to college. It was repressed.
Was that your experience, Richard Sipe, because you were a priest?
Yes, certainly. And I think that you make an excellent point. This is the only major subject that was not raised at the council. And, of course, what was split off was the question of contraception. And Paul VI set up this special commission, and they didn't come out with or he didn't come out with his conclusion to that to 68. And of course, it raised a terrible hubbub. Of course, now the average Catholic does not believe in what the encyclical said, but